Hi, this is Phill Klein. Thank you for joining me again for First Principles, where we discuss that freedom is not complicated, but unfortunately in America today, preserving it is becoming more complicated. Today, I have the honor of having as a guest Harmeet Dhillon, who's one of our nation's and in fact international leaders as it relates to several issues of law. Harmeet leads the Dhillon Law Firm with offices in London, San Francisco, and New York. She also is the first woman that was elected as vice chair of the California Republican Party and has taken a lead in election integrity issues, not only in this past election, but previous to that. So Harmeet, it's great to have you with us today, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Now, I'm curious, you've always had kind of a political itch, it seems, as I read a little bit about your background and at Dartmouth. How did you get and gather this interest in politics?
Well, my parents came to the United States when I was very young, 2 years old, and they and I were born in India. We stopped in England on the way, and my father was an orthopedic surgeon and wanted to make his life in the United States, where it was free, where the government wasn't telling you what crops to grow and how many children you could have, and other socialist policies we were seeing in India back at that time. And so growing up in rural North Carolina was a very eye-opening situation for my family. When they became citizens, my parents registered as Republicans because at the time, Republicans were the party that were actually standing up against segregation in the South. 1970s, we still had segregation in small towns in the South. And they were also, as small business people, my dad running a medical practice, very interested in issues involving taxation, property ownership, tort law, public policy issues, cultural conservatives as observant religious Sikhs, and leaders in their Sikh community. And so they found a resonance with the party that way. And that's what we talked about around the dinner table: issues of public policy, supporting candidates, and getting involved as new citizens in the United States. So it really came from there. And I went to Dartmouth at age 16 after going to a science and math public boarding school in North Carolina. And when I arrived at Dartmouth, I found fellowship there with a handful of conservatives. My predecessors at the Dartmouth Review newspaper included Dinesh D'Souza and Laura Ingraham. So they're longtime mentors of mine over the years, and really kind of focused in on studying the classics and really understanding American and world history and literature. And, from there, kind of that was a solid grounding to explore our conservative movement and, sort of have stayed in that vein my entire career in life.
So the power of ideas kind of enthralled you. As you look at America today, how has it evolved since your first dive into the founding ideas of America? And is that evolution concerning to you, and how?
Well, I don't think I would even recognize, the campus today at Dartmouth, compared to my having the ability to take classes of small groups of 2 or 3 students reading ancient Greek and Latin and the classics, and having some really outstanding English professors and history professors and public policy professors. I think all of those things are mocked now as, old school, but we saw the beginnings of it back then. We had professors and students, pushing Sandinista policies and, decrying Shakespeare and other literature curriculum subjects as, just dead white men. So this has been a trend in American academia for a long time. But today, what I see is there is very little conversation between the right and the left. I think back then we did have those conversations. We were able to have debates on campus and have different speakers come and speak. I think that's increasingly going away now. And we really have a cacophony of people talking at each other and very little common ground in this country. And I think that's actually a very recent development, or at least it's manifested itself very recently. I think even 4 years ago, you did not see the type of chaos and cross-purpose and lack of common ground as we see today in our academic institutions and in our political discourse as well.
As I remember my college years and a similar time frame, maybe a little bit earlier, the Sandinistas, the liberation theology, the capturing of Christianity and converting it into a political movement. But I remember this about our college debates, so to speak. uh, we believe to give a fool a platform. In other words, elevate the discussion so that everybody could participate rather than silence those with whom you disagree. But what does this harbor for us as a nation?
Well, there are a few things that are really trending our country towards a very anti-intellectual and anti-accomplishment position. We are seeing just this year, for the first time, you're seeing multiple states and multiple state boards of education pass educational policies that try to dumb everybody's math and science grades down to the lowest common denominator, which can only be exciting to our competitors around the world. Russia, China, other countries, even Europe, don't have these dumb rules. The erasure of history. You have your 1619 project, and thankfully that professor did not get tenure at UNC, but it was a close call. And we have just the wholesale rewriting of our country as a racist country, calling white people racist, people who did not own slaves or live in slavery, and ignoring the history of the world that includes, winners and losers on both sides of all races, and, kind of understanding that as a way to sort of craft policy going forward. All of that is being torn up and destroyed. And it's a really disturbing, nihilistic trope that is happening in our country, and people are afraid to stand up and call it what it is. And I think that's what's lacking, is frankly principled leadership on the right, at least in people of power. I do not think tweets and Fox News appearances are a substitute for sound public policy. And frankly, our Republicans have been silent in Congress and in staffers in the White House when they had a chance to pass reforms that, for example, canceled Americans off of social media, led to widespread firing of people in academia and persecution of people in jobs. I filed lawsuits over all of these issues, but I've frankly not ever been backed by people with power. And so, one or two lawyers like you and I, warriors in the courts, can make a difference. Only in that case, it's hard to have, sort of a broader impact without political power.
Recently, I've seen the left make a concerted effort to consolidate all authority, all jurisdiction, and all ability to speak into any issue of our life at the national level, almost as if Mr. Biden wants to be our father, so to speak. And unfortunately, I have seen the Republican Party not speak against that growth of national jurisdiction. Do you see that as a concern?
Well, this is a problem that's been dating back to at least the time since I've been paying attention to politics, even before I could vote. That would be in the Reagan era. And, President Reagan talked about eliminating the Department of Education, and that didn't happen. Today, I think just yesterday, I saw a Republican senator introduce a bill to sort of nationalize the concept of money following the students. Historically, Republicans have always been in favor of local control as much as possible of everything. And, much as I agree with the concept and would vote for it locally, I don't think the federal government has anything to do with that. And I think that the federal government doesn't have anything to do with many things. I don't think Asians should be beaten in the streets, or anybody, but I don't think, frankly, the federal government constitutionally has jurisdiction over so-called anti-Asian hate crime violence. The concept of a hate crime itself is anathema to any serious scholar of the First Amendment. Yes. It's sort of getting into somebody's head. It's Clockwork Orange type of stuff. I mean, how do we get into people's heads? We should be punishing people's actions and not their thoughts. And so yet Republicans happily have ceded that and are just playing along. And particularly irresponsible is when you don't have a majority and can't pass the bill, just introducing show legislation for clicks and for fundraising purposes, I think is irresponsible and, really craven, frankly.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I remember I was a state legislator in Kansas when we had our first hate crimes bill, which I voted against, predominantly because I believe all crimes of battery and assault are crimes of hate. And as you said, it is thought police. It is ceding to government the definition of what hate is. And when you cede to government the authority to define hate, it could just define you as hateful or offensive. And in fact, that's what we're seeing. So thank you for pointing that out. There's not enough political courage to say, wait a minute, I don't think Asians should be beaten, but neither do I believe that we ought to control thoughts because government is very poorly situated to have that type of authority or power. As it relates to the elections, what did you see? What is most concerning? And are we doing anything to address it?
That's a hard question because there are many concerning things about our elections. And again, I believe this is an issue that should be run by the states for the most part. In fact, the Constitution requires almost every issue having to do with our United States elections to be run at a state level with some minimum standards in federal legislation. What we have seen for decades is, and by the way, both Republican and Democrat administrations, a failure to enforce those federal election laws that require the cleaning up of the voter rolls, that require some minimum standards. We don't do that. And states like California, for example, with 40 million people, the biggest population state in America, are habitual offenders in compliance with these federal statutes. And because they get away with it. And in fact, we now have error-ridden rolls around the United States that include tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people in Los Angeles County alone, as the state of California admitted, who do not belong on the voter rolls. So that is a recipe for disaster when you combine that with automatic vote by mail, like we had during this pandemic. And you add to that issues like a lack of transparency, with citizens not being allowed to witness the counting of the votes, and in fact, election officials lying to the public, to the press, and to citizens about why the viewing is not being allowed. You have a lack of consistency, which is a basic fundamental equal protection and due process norm, where your signature will be counted differently in a different county, and depending on whether Mark Zuckerberg gave money to that county. So there are so many issues that have to be addressed. And the problem is that there's no quick fix to these issues for conservatives, if they're being honest, at the federal level. This is work that must be done state by state, lawsuit by lawsuit, intervention by intervention, and in the trenches. It's difficult. You cannot go on Fox News or introduce a piece of sham legislation that won't pass and accomplish your goal. So I'm proud to be doing that hard work with Republican legal organizations and conservative groups. We are, spending a lot of time rolling up our sleeves and doing that hard work. But on the other side, we can easily see how the left is trying to solve this problem. And their problem is Republicans ever win an election. That's their problem. There's no talk of bipartisanship anymore in our country. And so what they would like to do with H.R. 1 and its progeny is simply nationalize our elections and nationalize them with the lowest possible standards and stacking the deck. And this is obviously unacceptable. Our country will be over as a country if we allow this. And so part of those efforts as well. But, we must keep our eye on the prize. It is not just H.R. 1, but pieces of H.R. 1, son of H.R. 1, daughter of H.R. 1 that's going to get passed, and other pieces of legislation if we're not alert. And also, of course, state law changes and reforms that may make it impossible to ever win elections again. And so this requires eternal round-the-clock vigilance. It requires vigilance in red states, which is where it has been lacking, and it requires vigilance in blue states where occasionally we do win races, like in California. We would not have picked up some of the Republican seats that we did in the 2020 election cycle without a state party willing to stand up and file lawsuits or threaten them, and willing to stand up to the bullies who wanted leftist unions to be able to do ballot harvesting, but did not want Republicans to be able to do the same thing in gun stores and churches. So this is a multi-factor issue that has to be fought at every level by everybody. There's no passive involvement in this issue. People have to pick sides and then be prepared to, contribute their time and their treasure to fighting this.
One of the things that we noticed as we engaged this is that the 2020 election, much of it is the fruit of over 15 years of leftist planning, ever since Bush v. Gore. And it seems to me that conservatives have not had the long-term vision that you've seen on the left. And I find that rather surprising. In fact, it's somewhat counter to an understanding of us as people of faith, that we don't have that long-term vision. Do you see a problem with that? I'm curious. There's problems with our institutions in America that support democracy, from political parties to journalism to government itself. Where is the vision now in our country?
Well, so I think we've had a false illusion of a vision. And again, you date back to the Reagan era. I spent my first year after college at the Heritage Foundation. And, those were heady times, 1989. We were, ascendant as a conservative movement. And we had passed a lot of great ideas, tax reforms, so many things that President Reagan did. And, then you start getting into this sort of, maintenance phase of the revolution. And that's where things begin to break down. And today I would say some of those institutions that I've worked for in the past have been co-opted. They are sort of captured by lobbyists. Certainly, in my opinion, most members of Congress should be replaced, certainly on the Republican side. They are willing to make speeches to the cameras and on television in the House chamber or the Senate, and then go to receptions afterwards and take money from the very organizations that they are condemning from the chair with the camera on. That's a bipartisan problem, but I'm only really concerned about the Republican side of that equation. That's why we have oligopolies controlling speech in this country, is because Republicans, when they had power, did nothing about it and took cash from these companies. That is the hard truth. The same is true of elections. We have Georgia was dominated by Republicans at every constitutional seat that mattered in the last election. They were happy to look the other way while Mark Zuckerberg bought the election, and while they stood on the stairs of their state houses and condemned Republicans. We controlled the legislature in Pennsylvania and sat there while the courts there sort of usurped the constitutional function of the legislature drafting the laws, because Republicans don't pay attention to seats that are not president, House, and Senate. They don't pay attention to the Supreme Court races. We don't pay attention to registrar voter appointments. We don't pay attention to secretaries of state races. We don't invest in them the way that we do in, say, giving $10 million to some candidate who is attractive and running in a impossible district, D+30 district, who are never going to win that seat. That money could have bought prosecutors' offices, could have supported races throughout the United States, where we need conservatives to not vote conservative or put their finger on the scale, but simply apply the law as written. And that's a simple concept that is not being done today. So today, that's what I'm preaching around the country to conservatives is, yes, we should support our members of Congress, our senators, and certainly the good candidate for president, but also governors, but also the people who make the appointments for registrar of voters. He who counts the votes determines the outcome of the election. And yet there's almost no attention paid there. Republicans aren't staffing the offices. Republicans aren't the workers at the desk who check you in. If you're still old fashioned like me and you like to go vote in person, I'm not even sure that's going to be allowed in California anymore. But when I could go vote in person, I would walk from my home in San Francisco to my voting place 2 or 3 blocks away. And there were no Republicans staffing those places as poll workers, let alone poll watchers. And we have plenty of people who could do that. And that type of activism would change the outcome of elections legally. And we need to be encouraging that.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. One of the things that I learned when I was a prosecutor is that as a prosecutor, I didn't have to count votes. I didn't have to get a governor's signature. I decided. And there are 30,000 local prosecutors in this nation, and George Soros thinks they're important enough to give monies directly to them. Yet most Republicans cannot name who their local county attorney is. And they make decisions every day on how to apply the law, and their power is more broad than a member of Congress. And so it's true about election officials too. We need to engage. I'm real curious if with these failings that we see, if you see a party realignment occurring.
Well, I'm a member of the Republican National Committee. I represent California there, and I speak to political operatives and lawyers and candidates every single day, Saturdays and Sundays included. And so what I'm seeing is, quite a bit of dissatisfaction in the grassroots and even amongst the wealthy donor base with the party. But you still see the same lawyers getting hired, inside the Beltway to make the challenges. You still see the same consultants who have run failed campaigns, hired again to run new races. You see the same vendors who take a bunch of money to make flashy ads and their candidates lose being retained. You see a lot of institutional inertia still there in the party. And positive signs are you see some great freshmen in our Congress this year and some younger members from the last 4 years, I think, who are willing to stand up. Those are the people who are saying, if Nancy Pelosi can attend a reception at the White House where she and 100 or 200 of her best friends are not masked and breathing in each other's faces, then it is hypocritical for her to assign fines to members in the House who have been vaccinated. All these people have been vaccinated who are not wearing masks, because guess what? The CDC says we don't have to wear them anymore if we're under the circumstances. So we need that type of courage. We need civil disobedience in this country of the nature that we had in the civil rights movement. People standing up for what they believe, being willing to be arrested, and certainly picketing and talking and protesting. That's what I'm seeing is a real hunger for that. We have citizens who are becoming disenfranchised or disenchanted rather with political parties. You might think that's a good thing. Oh, we're going to punish those Republicans by not, being switching our voter registration. Well, it doesn't really work like that. We do have a two-party system, and simply abandoning that structure, or worse yet, going over to the Democrat side, means we lose. And so we need to be smart about it at the local level. Any citizen can certainly make a difference at a county level and demand change at their state level as well. And so I'm part of that system. I've been a volunteer in politics for decades now, and I think the system works, but it requires many people, not just a few, to be interested and put their shoulder to the wheel.
I want to shift for a second to the business community nationally. And I've read a little bit about your practice. It's remarkably varied. And you spent quite a bit of time on intellectual property and representing small businesses and some large businesses in those conflicts. As I've watched COVID and government response to COVID, one of the things that's undeniable is we saw a significant shift of wealth away from small business to large business. And I'm curious as to whether you see the shapings of a corporate oligarchy or influence on America that is driving these policies as much or more than maybe science is as it relates to the shutdowns.
Well, I don't know if it's as much or more per se. I'm not really equipped with the data to weigh that, but I think that certainly the concentration of power in the hands of a few economically or politically is a bad thing. And our, Constitution was written as such, and our laws have been written as such. But Republicans have been as bad as Democrats in very weak to non-existent antitrust enforcement. We saw that in the recent administration. I was a big fan of President Trump. Non-existent antitrust enforcement, really, particularly where we needed it the most in big tech consolidation. And so now you have a handful of companies that didn't even exist 20 years ago dominating speech and communications throughout the world, dominating our news, telling us what we can see and what we can say. This is extraordinary. It didn't have to be this way. In fact, Europe has much more aggressive antitrust and privacy enforcement against these big tech companies, but Europe is irrelevant in the marketplace when you compare it to the United States and China, particularly a much larger market than the United States. So very soon, I'm afraid, if we do not stand up and change the direction this country is heading and this concentration of power in the hands of a few billionaires, and frankly, by the way, the worship of many conservatives of corporations. I think that that's one of the problems we've seen in these institutions, the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute, and even, some of my friends at the Federalist Society, there is a genuflection and virtual worship of the rights of corporations over the rights of humans. Corporations are a creation. They're a fiction. They're a creation of our laws and our decisions. They don't have, inherent rights in and of themselves, and certainly not superior to those of individual voices. Yet we have been because of lobbying and money, very protective of them at the expense of individual rights. So today, I have threatened lawsuits ongoing against PayPal for sort of not letting a flag seller sell his flags and holding on to his money. Twitter, CNN, gosh, you name it, many other institutions as well. And they are getting away with things today they wouldn't have been able to get away with 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Left and right would have agreed it is dangerous to allow corporations to have so much power over citizens and really put small businesses out of business, kill jobs, outsource, censor. All of these bad things that we criticize in other countries is happening in our country, and politicians of both parties are nodding and taking the checks. So this is a real problem.
Do you see a difference between the general views towards governments of your generation as compared to some of the youth who took to the streets this summer? And what message would you give to the younger generation about the direction of this country?
Well, I'm not sure the younger generation is even speaking the same language as I am. The fact that in our universities today, a majority of students believe it is appropriate to silence and censor views with which they don't agree, that is something that their parents and grandparents fought for the opposite side of that, left and right. And it was actually the left in this country, UC Berkeley, that sort of started the free speech movement on college campuses, because it was anti-war, and the anti-war protesters were being shut down, and so they established the important rights in this country of young people being able to protest and share their views. And the opposite is true now. Young people are the ones who, like in the Cultural Revolution in China, are trying to shame and censor their elders and shut down speech they don't like. We have seen the disturbing scenes of violence in American streets over this past week, with Jews being beaten in our streets by organized mobs. So what I would tell young people today is look at history, look at human history, and look at what kind of decadent cultures or dysfunctional cultures existed where this type of violence and this type of behavior was tolerated and promoted by powerful people. And you will see that this is not the direction that we want our beautiful, wonderful country to go in. I think that, quite apart from that, taking out politics from it, the fact that American students are encouraged to study gender studies and, frankly, nonsense that doesn't pay for a living versus science and math allows our country to be vulnerable economically and politically to foreign powers where math and science and transferable skills are at a premium. So I think that the development of COVID and sort of universal basic income, basically, of unemployment checks coming every month for a year, when there are jobs available throughout the United States right now, I know this because I'm an employer, that's very dangerous. And it is very easy for people to get addicted to the opiate of cash and not working. Work has its own rewards, as people of faith believe, in my faith as well. It is taught that you cannot be a good person and a complete person without being a good family person and being a good worker and being humble and also spending time with your faith. None of these things are being taught to young people today. Everything is a function of some charismatic leader or some political movement or some latest idea du jour. People who are carrying and rioting over Palestine this week were rioting over something else last week. So this is a very nihilistic and destructive culture that doesn't produce anything. And so we need to get back to producing things in this country and being self-sufficient.
And what is the key on education? How do we recapture? And I appreciate that you brought up the fact of the management of the conservative revolution. One of the mistakes of George W. Bush, of course, was No Child Left Behind and the nationalization of education and supporting that. How do we get back to a basic fundamental education that prepares these students to compete in the economy today and also stills them with an understanding of what America is?
Well, not every parent's going to be able to do this for economic reasons, because we've now developed ourselves into a society where economically, tax rates and housing rates are all tolerated that require both parents to work outside the home. That is, I'm thankful that in my old-fashioned traditional family, my mother was a homemaker during the formative years of her two children's upbringing, and then she decided of her own volition to work after that. Most people don't have that luxury today, no matter how much money they make. It's certainly in San Francisco where I live, it's virtually impossible to have that type of luxury here. It's very expensive to live here. But if you can, and your parents move out of the cities and have a lifestyle that allows more hands-on training and support of the children, take charge of children's education. Do not let your children be educated by crazy, woke, critical race theory teachers and teachers unions. That is a recipe for disaster. Those kids will grow up to hate America and turn on you and generally reject everything you stood for and worked for. So I see it with my own two eyes and children who I know, and it's very disturbing.
Any predictions for 2022 or 2024?
I predict more unrest in our country over the next 2 years. I predict that if Republicans are not able to win back the legislature and ultimately the White House, with certainly on the legislative side some fresh blood, then we are going to get more of the same. And so what I am seeing, however, in the COVID era here in San Francisco and other big cities is some people have taken the opportunity to move out of the cities. And big tech companies have abandoned our cities, and they have allowed people to work from home. Some of them are working from home in more conservative places than where they were living before. That could be a good thing, because ultimately we are all human beings who are made in God's image, and we have needs and we have wants and desires, and we can fool ourselves with the illusions of what we see on television and around us. But ultimately, I think our basic human nature will come through if allowed to nurture and flourish in a more natural setting. So that's a positive thing out of COVID, and maybe that will help us revitalize some of our suburban and rural areas in this country, and maybe galvanize people to run for office and elect better people, and have some turnover in our leadership on the right.
Harmeet Dhillon, thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today, and thank you for your leadership and staying on the battlefield in trying to provide vision and leadership for this nation. I thank you for your time, ma'am.
Thank you, Phil.
Phill Klein and First Principles. And in previous shows, I've heard a lot of people echo what Harmeet just told us. She was speaking about how it begins with the family, how it begins with you getting up each morning and deciding, what values you're going to teach your children, what values and decisions you're going to make to live by. We heard Yaku Boyens say that each day in the morning, get up and say, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? We heard a pastor talk about managing your own bean field. The great thing about America is that Americans eventually get what they want. The risk to America is America gets what they want. And so start at home and be a part of the solution. You can have an impact on this nation if you have the courage, like Harmeet and many others, to stand for your convictions and speak and overcome this fear that is strangling meaningful discourse in this nation. Your voice is needed. This is Phill Klein. Thank you for joining us on First Principles.